You're listening to the MindPod Network. Support for this podcast is made possible by listeners like you. Head on over to zachleary.com and use the Amazon portal to buy your stuff, or just make a donation using PayPal to support this podcast, bringing you content week in and week out. It's all happening. 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 It's all Cruelty has a human heart, and jealousy a human face, terror the human form divine, and secrecy the human dress. The human dress is forged iron, the human form a fiery forge, the human face a furnace sealed, the human heart its hungry gorge. And welcome to the podcast, episode 107 of the It's All Happening with Zach Leary podcast. That is me, your host, and I am so happy that you're here. How very cool is it? This episode of the podcast, or I should say this intro to the podcast, is being recorded in Boise, Idaho, at my friend Caesar and Jamie's house. And my good old friend Caesar is going through some health stuff right now, so put out your cosmic vibrations that tap into the multiverse, that tap into that plane of consciousness that is disembodied, that is connected to each and single, every one of us, that is the universal life force that goes through each and every one of us into our souls and into our hearts. Tap into that and send out some love and some prayers from my buddy Caesar. And this week on the podcast, we have Daniele Bolelli on the podcast. Very cool, very cool. We'll talk more about that in a second. But first, I wanted to give a big thank you and a big shout out to everybody who wrote or tweeted at me or whatever and asked when the next episode was coming out. It's so cool that people pay attention to that, and it really means a lot. And yeah, the only delay in it really was, I think sometimes when you're just piloting your own ship and you've been on autopilot for a while, for over 100 episodes, and then with the addition of the Maps podcast, yeah, sometimes it just felt like the necessary thing to do was just to step back for a couple of weeks and just reassess and reset, and just to see where I'm at internally, and to take note of what's going on out there in the world, and to see how I best could contribute to that. So that's what happened. And we don't have to get into the whole personal melodrama, but we're back. This is a new episode. The poem at the beginning was from William Blake, and I just wanted to read that. For some reason, that poem just sprung into my mind when I was thinking about that, everything that was going on out in the world, in the media sphere, as it relates to all the sexual harassment charges and allegations that bubbled up and sprang and reverberated and bounced off the cosmic holy fuck, what the hell is going on out there in the world backboard from the Me Too movement. There's no question that all the seats of power are fraught with patriarchal sort of knee-jerk reactions that bump up against gender roles, and bump up against how power is attributed and distributed in the relationship with that, and greed and impulsiveness and compulsion, and of course, not to mention sexual perversion and maybe even sexual addiction and things like that. And now that we're just basically finding out that, I guess, everyone who's ran any sort of, media empire or show or been in charge of an animation studio like John Lasseter, or a stand-up comedian like Louis C.K., all has some kind of very complicated, at times very troubling skeletons to come out of the closet. So definitely not a good thing. But, not a good thing at all. But one thing that I definitely would say, at least from my perspective, is I don't look to any of the artists out there in the world who are making great content. I don't look at them, and I don't look at them to be stewards of moral high grounds at all. If that were the case, then I would have to throw out all the books by William Burroughs or Allen Ginsberg or whoever. These guys are not my moral compasses. So I'm definitely able to separate the man from the work. I still think Louis C.K. is a very, very funny comic. There's no question that his wielding of power, which was actually more problematic than the actual deed that he did, it was the power play about, if you tell anyone I'm going to ruin your career, sort of thing, which was really the most troubling part of those allegations. But, artists are complicated and dark, and, there's no question we need to hold them accountable. But I also don't think we need to delete all their content from the internet. And that's my 2 cents on it. But, I think I have to say most importantly that, when these things happen or something like this happens in mass, not just one person, but dozens and dozens of people that you, really look up to, or whose, contribution to the content world you respect. For me, it always triggers something that has me look inside, that has me do an internal inventory about, in this case, about, all the times out there in the world where I've been inappropriate, to where I don't really think about my actions before I do them. I can be very, very impulsive, and have made, decisions that I regret for sure. And I've certainly never done anything criminal or anything like that in this respect, but I've behaved inappropriately at times for sure. And I think this is a good time where every man who's ever held a seat of employment, who's had people work for them, or just lived a colorful life, it's a time to pause and reflect and see where it is we can all improve as men and come together and not fall into just the cliche of men behaving badly and being pigs and not being able to control their impulses. And so this week on the podcast, enough of my rambling. Oh my goodness. Sorry, that was long-winded. We have Daniele Bolelli, who you know and love from the Duncan Trussell Family Hour and his own podcast, History on Fire, and of course the Joe Rogan Experience and his amazing books, Start Your Own Religion and Not Afraid. And he's just so fantastic. We did it in person, and it was just such an easy podcast to jump into. He just immediately is a fantastic mind to dance with, to engage with, and just to see how his train of consciousness, how his train of thought works, and how he strings ideas together. I learned so much from just hanging out with him for an hour and podcasting with him. So I really hope you enjoyed the episode. This is the first of many, I'm sure. I hope, at least. And take it away, Daniele Bolelli. Daniele, thank you for coming to the podcast.
Thanks so much for having me, man.
Oh man, it's such a pleasure. I've been following your work for a while now. It's really good to have you here in person too.
The live version. We don't have to do Skype or anything like that. I know I like it so much better when conversations are happening face to face.
It's so much better, isn't it?
Yeah, Skype is convenient, but because sometimes there's somebody who lives across the country, it's either you do it that way or you don't. Yeah. But the live version is definitely different.
And there is something about Skype that does sort of like, my view on, not just mine, but our view on technology is like cyberspace is a place.
Right.
It's a dimension.
Yeah.
and there you are hanging out in that dimension, sharing it. But it's for conversation, it's not as good.
And it's funny because we were just saying right before we turned on the mics, we were talking about how it would be so much cooler if jobs allow you not to be physically present in an office but being remote.
We were just saying that.
But there's also the other side, that for certain things the physical presence is a lot cooler, and it's like both are true, both are true.
And a team meeting once a week, that's fine.
Exactly.
Right, yeah, no, it's true. But moving away from work, I do want to get back into that, but I did want to kind of jump in with religion for a second. And being the expert you are on comparative religion and the world's religions, what sort of temple or idea or religion do you think we are sort of at the altar of today? Is it greed? Is it money? What is it? Is it ignorance? I mean, what do you think is the defining religion of today's world? I'll tell you why I ask that after you answer.
Sure. That's a good one. Let me play with it in my head for a few seconds. I think, let me toss this around. I mean, all the things you mentioned, of course, there's that. They are all, that's why I think I hesitate in answering, not because I don't have a few answers that pop in mind, but when we say the one, it sounds like way bigger than all the others.
Right.
I think right now there's such a transformation of everything. The world that we live in today is nothing like the world we lived in 30 years ago.
That's right.
Not 1,000,000 years ago, not 100 years ago, not 50, not 30 years ago. 30 years ago was a completely different world.
That's totally true. Yeah.
And everything is changing. Work is changing, religions are changing, philosophy, everything about everybody's life is changing so dramatically that I think that something like religion, which is typically kind of slow moving, one of the appeals of religion is this sense of stability through the centuries. That's been seriously challenged at a time when everything is moving at the speed of light and is changing at such crazy speed.
Yeah.
It's a bit of a challenge for these things that are supposed to be, by the way, because then in reality, religions, of course, change a lot over time. There's no argument, but the image at least, and part of the reality is that they are these monolithic entities that remain, hold fast forever.
Right.
At a time of incredibly fast change, something's got to give. And one of the things that I notice in terms of religion is two opposite things happening at the same time, as it's often the case.
Yeah.
On one end, you have the tendency toward mixing a lot more, because we live in a global world, right? So today we have the opportunity to take from different sources. Back even again 50 years ago, you were born in one place. You pretty much knew what religion somebody practiced based on geography.
Sure.
Because that's all you knew.
And that's all that was permitted.
Exactly.
Even. Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Now, it's still true in many places, but it's becoming less and less true as the internet spreads. And
parts of the Middle East still true, though.
Absolutely. Certainly still true, but progressively less.
Yes, of course.
But at the same time, there are all the people who are scared of these changes. The fact that you have all these choices, you have this possibility to mix ideas, to take the best from multiple different things. Many people are scared that what they value about their tradition is being watered down.
Right.
And instead, what you have is this mishmash that they feel like we're losing our essence, we're losing who we are. And so one of the things I see in that regard is a running toward fundamentalism just as much as running toward a more open-minded approach to religion, and both are happening at the same time.
Yeah, that's interesting, and we see that that's very pronounced in America.
Oh yeah,
right. It's very pronounced, and the reason I asked this is because I was just reading some polling data this morning, and that Trump's he's still in the mid to high 30% of approval, but something like 70% of evangelical Christians not only support him, but think that he's a Christian.
Right.
Which is it's a very sort of twisted reality to me, because it makes me think that what exactly are the tenets of Christianity these days then? What exactly does that mean? I thought it meant something else, and I know many good Christians out there in the world, no doubt about it, but I mean, what is it? What is it that they see that fits into that paradigm? And it just makes me think like, well, what are the real values today? What's really important today?
Well, and I think that's what it is that people they have gone from having such little access to sources of information to being bombarded with information and not knowing how to distinguish crap from good stuff.
Yeah.
Because it's hard, it's objectively difficult, because if every article you read, you have to research 20 times. Who's the person who did it? Who's paying for it? The reality is that most people seem to be struggling with distinguishing reality from fantasy.
Yeah.
And so in a very almost extreme postmodern scenario, there is no consensual reality. People seem to argue that somebody else's objective facts are just an opinion, and they are just as valid as somebody else throwing something out there. And so there's this confusion going on where people I think have done it forever because it's how the human mind works, but even more so due to the information age. People make up whatever they want to believe, which in some way is not that different, because if you go back, like the example of Christianity, you could have Christians who are all highlighting the passages in the Bible that are all about forgiveness and love your enemy and turn the other cheek. Yeah. And the other one would read that stuff, be like, yeah, I mean, that's great and all, but let's keep to the good stuff. Yeah. And they would focus on the more intolerant, bloodthirsty passages that are also there.
Right.
Same thing with the Quran, same thing with pretty much anything, right? So that's why you could end up with these completely opposite interpretations of the same tradition.
Well, and that mentality of being able to pick and choose sort of what works for you at any time, I mean, that is very much... that's the same mentality as sort of looking around the media sphere and dictating your own narrative. I mean, that's what that's what fake news is.
Yeah, exactly.
The fake news idea. It's not that it's fake. It's that I don't agree with it. I'm going to put that aside. Therefore, it's fake news.
Yeah, and I think it's a problem because even that, like, the idea that you can pick and choose stuff that works for you, there's something very good about it.
Sure,
you know what I mean?
Creating your own reality.
Exactly.
I mean, that's the psychedelic world.
Perfect.
Being able to create your own.
Exactly. Yeah. I love that,
that's
right?
Great, yeah.
But just in the exact same way, it can be turned into a really dark, ugly thing where suddenly we are not just picking from objective facts, what's out there, but just completely making shit up just as we go with no care whatsoever for actual external reality.
Yeah,
there's a bit of a problem there.
There's a bit of a disconnect there because it's going to create too many extreme factions is the problem.
Absolutely. Yeah. And I think people gravitate toward the extreme because the more extreme a position is, the stronger the identity that it creates. You know, the more... It's funny because at a time when we have access to all this information and all of that, all the more open-minded approach to religion tend to be less popular than the more fundamentalist, which in some ways seems completely contradictory because you figure this is in this age of information, fundamentalism should be on its way out.
Yeah.
It's not at all. Because in the chaos of the modern age, fundamentalism offers you a fake, but at least it looks like it could be the real thing, a fake sense of security, a fake sense of we have all the answers. We know, we understand the world is confusing out there, but we know, just follow these rules, do this, don't do that, go with the good, avoid the bad, in this very dualistic, oversimplified model of reality.
So is that what attracts the fundamentalists?
I think so. Yeah. I think it's very appealing because it's reassuring. You don't have to think so damn hard. It's like, hey, it's simple. Follow these rules.
Right.
Do these things. Don't do this other thing. The reason why everything bad is happening in the world is because of those bad people out there.
Right.
Follow the good leader and everything will be okay. Anybody who is less than fully self-confident may hear sort of the siren song of fundamentalism because it offers you a sense of clarity, a sense of, now it finally all makes sense. So I can see why. it works.
Yeah, I can see why it works. And in some ways, if you sort of just play it out and role play it, like in, the Middle Ages or just kind of ancient times, with it's a very violent world, and you're trying to, whatever was, whoever was coming to rape and pillage your land or something, you wanted to fight them off and you wanted to stay with this group because they had the better chance of winning.
Of course.
Yeah. And then today, I mean, I guess you could see the world as sort of, oh my God, it's pretty hectic out there.
Yep.
Right. It's pretty great. But that's a matter of perspective too, though, because I choose not to think of it that way.
Of course.
Yeah.
It's not that, but I think for the average person,
right.
Today is extremely chaotic, but the reality is that life is extremely chaotic.
But it's always been.
That's what I mean. It's
right.
like it's always been. So the fact that you have more information today doesn't necessarily make it then now I'm free to move away from these things. These things were also not just the product of ignorance, but they were the product of the appeal of having certainties in an uncertain world. Now, those certainties are bullshit. We know they are made up. They are, I'm saying, this is a certainty. It's not really a certainty. I'm making it up.
Right.
But the sound of it, the existential conditions of life are hard enough. Not knowing what happens after you die, not knowing what happens to your loved ones when they die, not knowing is there any meaning in the universe or is it just all about, all of those things are pretty stressful.
Yeah.
People can sort of push it aside and pretend those things are not there, but deep down, it's always there.
Yeah,
and so, how do you relieve existential anxiety with somebody telling you, well, we don't know. So try to make the best of life, take in the best, depending on what you think in each situation. I think it's the most honest answer, but it's not a very reassuring one.
It's not a very reassuring one, and I think the juxtaposition of trying to ease existential anxiety with sort of like the sociological sort of blueprint that we force on people, sort of what we're talking about, but the future of work thing, and this, pretty much the entire world, or certainly the Western world, and now, China and India to some extent, this model of, you're going to go through K through 12 in the cement building and you're going to work 9 to 5 and then just do that and you won't think so much about the existential crisis going on inside of you. And I don't know, I think just the more we plunge into the future, that's just a problematic model.
It is.
Yeah.
It certainly is.
Yeah.
And yet most people are not really equipped to deal with greater complexity because it's hard, because it's really damn hard.
Yeah.
And so that's
a lot of fear going on, too.
Of course.
Yeah.
Why wouldn't you be? We live in a very predatory universe where everything gets to be devoured, if not by physical creature, by time itself.
Yeah, I mean, do you think like the world like getting smaller though? Like not that I'm asking you for all the answers, Daniele, but the world getting smaller, like it's generally a good thing. Though,
it is. I certainly like the fact that you are less likely to be stuck with this model where you didn't know what was happening in the next valley, so you kind of build up this whole ideology based on ignorance.
Right.
No, I fully love where we are going in terms of, I think access to information is never a bad thing.
Yes.
I think access to knowing what actually happens in other part of the world, being able to go online and talking to somebody from that country in 3 seconds is awesome. Having said that, it's not without its problems, because it's kind of like, if you have access to 2,000 years ago, if you had access to the greatest library in the world and you barely know how to read, it's not going to help you a whole lot.
That's right.
And if anything, it's going to confuse you a lot. And that's part of the problem.
Yeah, it's part of the problem. And it seems like, but back to the religious thing too, because most religions, as far as I understand it, there is some sort of tenet or some sort of thread of compassion woven into the religion. So as the world is getting smaller, you'd think that there would be an increased amount of tolerance.
Well, here is my problem with, like, the way I usually tend to separate religions into different camps depending on how they answer one key question. Which is, do you believe that there's only one right way and everything else outside of that right way is bad and evil? Or do you believe there's more than one way to get to good answers? Because if you believe that there's more than one way, then we can sit down and talk, right? Then there's a discussion to be had. We can, there's room for negotiation. There's room for compromise.
Right.
If you believe that one way is the way and everything else is not just wrong, but because of the very dualistic nature of these worldviews is evil, there's
no
nothing to compromise. It's done. It's over. It's like, oh, you think different from me. Done. Over. You're on the side of, you're a servant of the devil. We're set. We're over. It's,
oh man.
that changes the conversation a little bit. While in a certain tradition, there may be very mellow, compassionate message. If the overarching theme is anyone who's not with us is on the side of evil and is going to forever burn in hell, that limits the even whatever compassion is in there is sometimes overshadowed by this other stuff.
Oh man.
And to me, it's not just about one religion versus another, because there are people, like typically Western religions tend to be on the more our way of the highway kind of approach.
Yeah.
And loosely speaking, tradition like Buddhism, Taoism, or so on tend to be on the more mellow, there's more than one way. But there are 10,000 exceptions to this.
Look what's happening in Myanmar.
Precisely, right? It's not that
oh
Buddhists are immune from, you don't hear all that often about a Buddhist fundamentalist, but it's not that you can't. It does happen.
It's happening.
Exactly. And it happened before multiple times in history. Theology only gives you a push in a certain direction.
Right.
But then individuals decide where they go with it. And while in which one theology is a lot easier to go along and go down a dark path, you can do it with anything, and vice versa. You can have the same way as in the 1600s, you could have hardcore Puritan fundamentalists who were pretty big on squashing dissent. And then you have Quakers who had this completely different, more mellow, pacifist interpretation of Christianity. And they were both Christian, and yet they could not be any more different from one another. Same thing happens in all traditions. Just because you tell me you are from tradition A, it doesn't really tell me shit. Because depending on how you interpret that thing and what it means in practice, like Christianity, there are over 30,000 different denominations of Christianity.
Really?
Yeah.
Is it that many?
Yeah.
Oh, shit.
I mean, almost all Protestant, right? It's like Protestant, Eastern Orthodox, Catholic, but within Protestant, there are like 3 gazillion variations.
Oh my God, I didn't know there was that many. Wow.
There are gay Christian and Christians who think that homosexuality is the ultimate sin. There are feminist Christian and Christians for super traditional hardcore gender roles. So tell me Christian doesn't mean anything. It's like, okay, you like Jesus, great. Right. So do a lot of other people. But that again does not tell me anything about the reality of your worldview, because as we're saying, people turn it into whatever they want.
Right.
And there will be a line there somewhere in the text that will support your interpretation, of course, as you're ignoring all the other lines. But
so it seems we need to sort of find this kind of global, middle ground, right? I mean, sort of come back to this place. And I find myself doing it too. I mean, I'm not immune from it at all, especially in the political spectrum.
Sure.
When, I go on Facebook or something or on Twitter and you're arguing and I'm arguing with Trump people. And, I'm just looking at them like, oh my God, you are absolutely insane.
Yep.
And I find myself not willing to even have the conversation.
Of course.
Yeah. And it's kind of it's a weird little trap that I find myself getting into.
It's human. It's normal. It's good to be aware of it because then it leads to dark things. But the impulse is not that hard to understand why we all operate like that.
Yeah, we do. And that's, and that's a very, in my case, that's really a remnant of the 60s. That was kind of an us and them sort of like, fuck the man, fuck the authoritarian thing. And you're going to be an us or them sort of, you know what I mean?
And it's especially hard not to play that game when somebody else is playing that game with you. It's hard not to react when they put you into either you're with us or you're against us. It's hard not to engage in the same way, not to respond in fuck you, I'm not with you, I'm on the other side then,
Right.
It's very hard when that game gets to be thrown in your face over, and it's easier with somebody who's mellow and willing to have a discussion and willing to listen and compromise. It makes us more receptive to that dimension. But if the other person, maybe you even initiate a compromise or a more mellow dialogue or willing to listen, and you get slammed with violent dogma after violent dogma, it becomes easy to turn that thing off. And of course, once you turn it off, it just becomes yelling at each other and nothing good comes out of it. But it requires a monstrous amount of patience and time to be able to navigate it without responding to the sort of lowest common denominator type of argument, where it's just, and the thing is, you can do it. It's hard. It's difficult.
It's difficult.
It's like, because to me, like, how do you do it? Well, you focus on what do we share in common. What is that we agree on?
Right.
You want your kids to grow up healthy and happy. Hey,
Right.
I do too. Let's start with that.
Right.
So let's start with, and then baby steps on where there's still a point of contact. And then realizing that when there isn't a point of contact where you go down a very different choice than I do, is not because I'm evil or you are inherently evil. It's because maybe we are trying to achieve the same goal in different ways.
Right.
And these different ways can clash badly. But so let's go back to the big picture. What is that we're trying to achieve? And this is not ideological. It's, does your way lead to this solution? If it does, you convince me. But I'll switch to your position.
Right.
But if it doesn't, let's consider whether there are other options that may work better.
Yeah, you're right. It's a very, like, even if you look at, a extreme right-wing Republican, you kind of want the same things. You want to live in a safe community where you can raise your kids and get them a good education, have good health care.
Right.
I mean, fundamental, basic.
Yep.
I mean, these aren't intellectual, heavyweight questions.
Exactly.
Right.
And it's like, okay, let's start with
Let's
that.
start
Let's
there.
start with the common point, because then we are not fighting each other. Okay, because otherwise, what's the point? We're wasting time. It's like, I don't want to yell at you. You yell at me. There's just make me angry. We waste time. Okay. So let's strategize. Let's figure out. And to me, that's an interesting thing in all discussion is how do we turn a discussion from a hostile, competitive discussion into a cooperative problem-solving issue. Now, we may not come to the same conclusion as what's the best way to solve that problem. We probably will not. But it takes a lot of edge from the conversation. It creates a little bit more compassion from somebody with a completely different viewpoint. Because rather than seeing you as you're just batshit crazy, I think there's a logical fallacy there where you go from this is what I want and this is my way to get about it. It's a little easier to be forgiving of that, even though you think, man, how do you not see it? This is pretty damn way. But I understand what you're trying to achieve. It mellows up the discussion a little bit,
How old's your daughter?
8.
What kind of, and she's been raised here in Los Angeles, right? What's she, does she view the world? When she goes to school, does she come back and does she see the world as how does an 8-year-old look at the school, at the playground these days as sort of like a safe, sort of cooperative place?
She's kind of sensitive, so she's, lots of things bother her. It's very easy for her to turn on into kind of angry child kind of mode.
Okay.
Because she's extra sensitive. And one of the prices of sensitivity is that more things can rub you the wrong way. It's also a gift because it gives you access to lots of deeper, cooler things. But there is that also side where sensitivity is one of the things. It's like you are born with a gift and a curse. Yes. And depending on how you play your card, that can turn into a huge gift or it can make you miserable. Probably both at some point in your life, but you're going to figure out a way to make it go one way or the other.
Right.
And
yeah, I'm the same way. For me, it manifested in a difficult scenario.
Of course.
Yeah, of course.
How doesn't it? And it's... Yeah. If you are born that way, and to some degree to me you are, some of it is how you're raised, of course. But some of it is also who you are. Some people have a greater emotional range, which I don't mean it necessarily as a good thing. Sometimes having a more mellow emotional range, there's something sweet about that.
Definitely.
But you have that for better or worse. So your good moments are +10 and your bad moments are -10, whereas the average person goes +1, -1. The potential for great things is there. The potential for great suffering is there. And so is how you handle normal life is different from how somebody who has a more normal degree of sensitivity will handle normal life.
And I think it sort of feels like, using the word feeling, it kind of feels like as a whole in our community and society, we're kind of encouraged to not be too vulnerable. Mm-hmm. You don't want to share too much.
Sure.
You want to compartmentalize and just soldier on and not fall apart and go to work and produce and keep being good producers. Mm-hmm. Which, I don't know, I find that a little bit counterintuitive because everybody is going to have some kind of, we were talking about existential crisis earlier, or emotional crisis, and you got to have some way to figure that out, some way to deal with it.
And I think it goes back to the usual dualism because people often either go into a hardcore, everything is fine, all happy pictures on Facebook, it's all the great life, all that, or is the opposite. And you go into this monstrous self-indulgence in gazing at your navel and complaining about the injustices of life. And it's like, okay, can we find a happy medium there where it's like you still get stuff done, you're still trying to, find a way to wake up in the morning and be positive while acknowledging all the emotional turmoil. And can we have, I think that's one of my problems with it tend to be, not to be overly Taoist, but that tend to be my answer to a lot of things, that I live in a world where I always see black and white answer, and my answers are always a weird dynamics mix of the two. If I'm given a choice between this and that, I rarely find it healthy to actually answer and pick this or that, because most of the time neither satisfy me. And somewhere, not necessarily in the middle, but somewhere in a mix of different things, I find a healthier answer. And instead what I find is typically people, for simplicity's sake, gravitate to a very black and white worldview. So again, it's about the specific instance you bring up. It's toughen up, no feelings, everything is good, don't complain, take care of it, or weeping oneself, whining about how evil the world is.
Right.
And it's like, I don't really like either. Can we have something else?
Yeah, and it's interesting you brought up the social media example because, I talk about this on the podcast a lot, and that's, as much as I love social media and the promise of social media and the promise of like an egalitarian internet and connecting people and everything, there is this degree of creating identity within it that has sort of become, I don't know, a little bit like, myopic. It's like people are creating these specific identities for themselves. Yep. Like I am, the hot half-naked girl on Instagram. Right. That is who I am. Mm-hmm. Yeah, or I am like the great, philosopher who posts, eloquent, long political rants or something like that. Yep. And it's kind of it's a funny dynamic about.
It's a trap. It's not who you are 24/7. And if you're living up to that, it means you're doing monstrous violence to actually who you are. So it's.
Yes, but I think it's translating because it's been here for a minute now. The novelty is worn off, and it's sort of like translating into us. Like, do you have screen time limitations for your daughter? Is she allowed to play on social yet?
It's no, I mean she's not doing social media.
Not yet. Yeah, too young.
No, she watched TV or something. Actually, not TV, but movies.
Right.
But, and I mean even that is like, okay, you're choosing the movies you watch. That's cool. You're not just flipping through channels. But of course, you only want to watch so many in a day because otherwise you start melting into the couch and just move around, do something else.
Yeah.
And that I get, because some things, when it's not just mindless TV or there is an appeal, you're having fun, but like anything, too much of a good thing, not a good thing anymore. So it's
it's interesting. I just think that it's becoming one of these things, like our behaviors in the digital world has become sort of one of these things that we have to learn. It's similar to the psychedelic thing in the 60s, like what's the integration model?
Definitely, because I find it, for me, monstrously addictive.
Fuck yeah, of course it is.
I have Twitter and Facebook open all day, and I'm just like, this is not helping me. A little is good.
Sure.
Past that point is not. And yet, even though I know what the right thing to do would be. I know what it is. It's like if I would give myself an hour a day top, or you say an hour, I reply to all the messages, I check the stuff I want to
check some stuff out, and right.
You know? Yeah. That would be healthy. But like all good junkies, I'm like, no, but it's fine, just a little more, it's okay. It's like, no, but I'm not looking at it all the time. It's like,
oh man,
it's complete addiction.
Oh my God. Mine is that and it's become this terrible habit, and so much so that I don't know where I got it from. It might have been from Tim Ferriss, but like I have to I put my phone downstairs at night.
Oh wow.
Because I'll wake up in the middle of the night, so invariably at 3 a.m, and I can't sleep, and I'll just roll over and just
no.
And it messes up my whole circadian rhythm, and looking at a screen in the dark like that, it really.
Well, you just made me feel better about myself. I haven't quite gotten there, so.
I do it. It really was messing with my sleeping, and I could feel like there's something about looking at the screen in the pitch black.
It's terrible, because then that's when you really don't fall asleep anymore. Yeah. Once you do that, your brain kicks in, everything else.
You start to get.
No, then it's bad deal.
You start to get a little nutty.
Yep.
Yeah, so I started putting my phone downstairs at night, and I just
wise decision.
Have a regular clock in my room.
Yes, good
just
decision.
Like we used to.
Yeah. I haven't even gotten to the point, like my phone, I use it for, text, phone, not a whole lot, like a map, if I need to go somewhere.
Yeah.
I don't use it for internet. And despite that, I still spend way too much time in front of a computer. So, I don't use the phone, but, if I did that too, I would take it even another notch up. And I'm already way past what's I consider a healthy point.
But do you think like the social media sort of, the addiction and the discussion and the way that we spend our time there, is this doing anything for our existential angst, or is it just just putting it aside?
I think it's putting it aside. It's a great distraction.
It's a great distraction.
Great distraction. And the thing that's frustrating too is that then there are the times when it's useful. You do meet awesome people that way sometime, and you do have great conversation, and you do find out, that article that I would have never seen otherwise, that kind of informs. And so that it becomes the justification to spend the next 6 hours looking at stuff. And it's like, there's a line there that should not be crossed, but it's so hard to draw it and to actually live to it, because there are huge advantages and huge disadvantages.
Yeah, there is. I mean, and it's like, and I find actually a lot of similarities between the, I guess, the cybernetic blueprint and the religious blueprint, in that, religion, the good fundamental parts of religion is it's about understanding your brothers and your sisters and being of service,
Totally.
Connection, helping out, brotherhood, all these kinds of things. And the internet in and of itself, it's about connection. It's about, information and understanding different walks of life and different cultures. But then both of them taken to their extreme, taken too far.
Yeah. It gets ugly
we get a little ugly really quick. But, we've seen, and this better than anyone, being a historian, this in 2017 is no exception, but we are repeating the same mistakes over and over and over and over again.
Human mind is what it is. It's just because we play with different tools doesn't mean that the human mind doesn't.
It's the human mind, huh?
Yeah. I think we gravitate. I mean, one of the themes, you see me hammering on the same thing over and over from different directions, but one of the themes that I really find one of the fundamental diseases of the human mind is how it tends to gravitate to oversimplistic answers because of the complexity of life. And so to me, the dualistic mentality, the black or white, this or that, if you are not with us, you are against us, the enemy of my enemy is my friend, all of those things are the same stuff, which is this, it all goes back to this model of, let me draw a neat line in the sand between the good and the bad. And again, it appeals to our desire for order, which is very understandable in such a messy world. And however, it completely violates the very basics on which life is formed. That is not like, that's a model that does not correspond to reality at all. We wish it did, because it would be simpler to handle it. And so what I keep finding is we always go back to these things of these binary choices, assuming that one of the two, there must be something good. And it kind of reminds me like US politics, right? Pick Trump or Clinton. And it's like, yeah, time out. How about I don't? How about, can I get a third option here? Can I get something else? Or it's like, the solution is either being in this camp or that camp. And almost unfailingly, even when I may like one camp better than another, I don't like either. I don't find either one particularly desirable.
It's a terrible predicament. Terrible predicament.
And that, I think, is why I'm attracted to Taoism, because for one, it's not really an identity per se. Like, you don't have to be a Taoist to understand Taoism, you don't have to. But that it's a little more about how life is, that is a mix of things. And the thing is, even the mix, our desire for simplicity, like to, it's a mix, so the answer is always in the middle. No, it's not. Sometimes it's in the middle. Sometimes it's at 90% of this and 10 of this. Sometimes it's the other way around. Sometimes it's constantly changing. And so it keeps you on your toes, but that's hard work. And most people are like, screw this. This is too much.
Yeah, and that's why and I want to ask you about Taoism in a second, but that's why some of the Trump stuff going on today, like, to me, and I don't feel this is me being sort of like a moral absolutist or anything, but there's like, this isn't conservative or liberal to me. This is just sort of basic fundamental values, simple stuff, like bad or good, right or wrong. I mean,
No, and that's the other thing, by the way, in all of this, because otherwise it sounds like I'm making a super relativistic argument where there never is a good or a bad.
No, but there is.
Exactly. To me, it's like, there are no absolutes, except when there are. It's like most of the time is not that simple, but sometimes it is.
Yeah, but white nationalists taking over the country, that's not a good thing.
No, that's not a good thing.
Period.
By any stretch. There is, one of the examples I always use is, there is no self-defense rape. You know what I mean? It's like, there is no, there are certain things that are bad 110% of the time.
Exactly.
And certain things that are pretty damn good all the the time. Most things are not that simple. But there are some things that are.
Right, exactly. So what, maybe you can just give me a little primer on Taoism.
Sure. I think one of the things that attracts me about Taoism is that it takes the idea of duality, which is, it's in everything around us, day and night, hot and cold, the male, female, we do see these categories, which is why then the black and white mentality makes sense to a lot of people. But it makes it a little more sophisticated. Rather than having it into this war between two opposites, Taoism is arguing that life is born from the dance of the two opposites, that everything is a mix of different energies. And the answer is rarely 100% in one camp or the other. You need to be raising your kids. In some occasion, you need to be a little more assertive, lay down the law, be a little more, hey, this is how it's going to be. But in other cases, or maybe even in the same case 3 seconds later, you also need to have the other side that's willing to have a discussion, to clarify, to explain to a kid why some things, or screw the law, forget what I just said. How about we just sit down and figure it out together, You need both. One approach alone is not going to work all the time. If you have these strict rules, most kids will rebel against them. If you have no rules ever, some kids will lack a sense of stability in certain things. You need to be able to figure out when each one is appropriate. Rarely an answer is always wrong or always right. There's timing in everything. It's kind of like cooking, It's like, you need to put in the right ingredient at the right time.
Of course,
The same exact ingredients, you put them at the wrong time, it turns to crap. And so, to me, Taoism is really about an art of timing, an art of mixing, and the ability to figure out what goes with what when. That's what it boils down to. And when you do it right, life is so much smoother. When you do it wrong, of course, you end up with the same problem that anybody else who get the wrong answer for the
Of course.
present situation does.
But what's the tool set for like, the ingredients of life? Like what's an example of sort of like, you use the ingredient metaphor for cooking, which is always a good one. But so with Taoism, like what's the equivalent of that?
So let's look at something like, I don't know, let's pick an example. There's been all this debate about masculinity in the last few years, arguing that basically, when there used to be real men back in the day, and then in the name of some feminist bullshit, people switch, and now all men are soft and delicate and lack a spine, and they can no longer chop down a tree or do these things, and they are a bunch of wimps.
Yeah.
There's something true to both sides of that story. The traditional model of masculinity was one that had some good to it. There was an emphasis on strength, on self-reliance, which are good values. I like them. But it also came at a price of squashing sensitivity, or squashing any semblance of being a more emotional human being, of being sometime this testosterone being sometimes in an abusive kind of way. So there clearly was something nasty about that too.
Yeah.
So in the name of realizing that there was something nasty about that, people have shifted to the opposite. But the problem is that in shifting to, okay, we should be more vulnerable, we should be more sensitive, emotions are important, yeah, you should. Sometimes people have also tossed the baby out with the bathwater, and so they have thrown out a lot of the more assertive, strength, self-reliant aspects of that model of masculinity. That those aspects weren't bad. Everything else that went with it was, but those aspects were actually good. And so here you're stuck between the black and white, right? Both models are not good. They are not particularly healthy. So the Taoist approach would be, you need yin and yang. You need strength. You need assertiveness. You need toughness. You need self-reliance. That also need to go in the same person with sweetness, with sensitivity, with the same guy who is lifting heavy weights should be able to read poetry. No contradiction between the two. You don't have to choose. The moment you're asked to choose between one or the other, again, you're missing on experience. I
see. Okay.
And that to me is what almost unfailingly makes sense to me. The answer in many cases is both. Take the best from both sides. Take what makes sense from more than one viewpoint, and the mixing of these things is what creates a healthy human being.
Yeah, and I love that, because it feels like, and I think, and I was going to talk to you about this too, like the MMA example, or sort of like, the extreme A-type guy.
Sure.
That is an identity. It takes a lot of work to get that big and that strong, and you're a certain type of human being. But, you can fall into this very, very rigid tool set.
Of course.
Where, you're an A-type guy, you're tough, fuck poetry, that pansy hippie shit,
Totally.
Yeah, so.
That's not a good model.
That's not a good model, right. But, yeah, it's not a good model, but that's a very human model.
It is. It's understandable.
Right.
But that, again, is why I find Taoism always interesting, because he rejects that game of the this or that. It's always inviting you to see what can you take from the opposite. Maybe it's 2%.
Yeah.
Maybe it's not that much. But there's always something there that's actually can enrich who you are, your choice, Like, I'm more interested in people who have both sides.
Right.
In different ways, because then everybody, their particular mix will be different, but they are mixing different energies together. If the yin-yang symbol, if it was about a rigid duality, it would be cut in two.
Oh, that's right.
The circle would be half white, the other one half black.
It curves, yes.
There's that gentle curve. It's almost a dancing, love-making symbol.
It's almost liquid.
It is. Those two opposites are constantly playing with one another, rather than being locked in this battle with one another.
I always felt that symbol was like, I've always visualized it as sort of like a tray of liquid that was it was being poured and it just moved around, and then it just happened to be frozen in time, and they caught it at that moment.
As Bruce Lee would say, it'd be like water, my friend.
Be like water, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, so not to take a total right turn, but I'm one of those people, and I didn't get a chance to ask Rogan about it the one time I met him and was on the show, but I wanted to, about the MMA thing that I don't get.
Sure.
And when I hear you explain it or Rogan explain it or something, I'm like, oh yeah, okay, I get that. But as a whole, I'm one of those guys guys like you are helping me to re-understand it, but I look at it as like the culture as one of like, and I almost feel like guilt in saying it, but as being part of the problem because it perpetuates violence.
Sure.
And I mean, it's a violent sport.
Yeah, there's no argument.
Right. So what am I missing?
I think, like I was reading the other day, George St. Pierre, which is probably the most successful MMA guy ever. And you see him, he's the soft-spoken, nicest, mellow guy. Right. And he says, I have a trouble with what I do because I don't like the fact that the game is about squashing this other guy, and inevitably my victory involves the other guy getting crushed. And he's the most successful guy there is, right? So there is that issue. At the same time, one of the things that fascinate me about it is that few things simulate kind of a very primal, raw conflict the way MMA does. So the other guy in that sense is not even the guy that I hate you, I need to squash you. The other guy is immediate feedback on everything in life that's going to make you look at your own weaknesses, is going to make you force you to deal with your fear. It's a very scary thing to get with somebody who's trying to knock your head off. So in a weird, odd way, the guy on the other side of the cage trying to knock your head off is doing you a favor, is a dancing partner who's helping you deal with conflict, deal with fear, deal with the fact that ultimately you don't control anything. You can become the greatest fighter in the world. You can still get your ass kicked because it does happen. So being able to deal with fighting on when things are hopeless. To me, MMA becomes just a metaphor for conflict in life. It's a very painful metaphor, but it's precisely because it has physical consequences that it delivers home the lesson a little more than some more philosophical ideals about it. Because, I can come up with the greatest philosophical answer on some things, but when you're there, all the philosophy go out the window. It's just how you're able to respond to the present situation.
At a very precise moment.
Exactly.
Yes.
Again, doesn't matter how good you get. Everybody get their ass kicked. I mean, that's a fact. Right. It's not even up for debate. It's not an if, it's a when and how often, but everybody loses.
And so part of the success within it is how you are going to deal with getting your ass kicked and being able to move on from that.
Absolutely.
Right.
There's that for sure. So I think in that sense is, if your personality is very hardcore, just very macho and so on, I think do Tai Chi and mellow out a little to balance it out a little,
Right.
If your personality is very sweet and sensitive, MMA is not a bad idea.
Right.
You know what I mean? It's a balancing act.
Because we do see, like, in the actual, the sport of UFC, we see, like, abnormal high rates of domestic violence.
Sure.
Right. Probably due to a lack of what you just said. Right.
I think it's people are attracted to what they already are.
What they already are.
So the ultra macho guy will get into it. That's not what that person needs.
Right.
They may need it, 5% just to kind of satisfy that itch that they have, but they need the bulk of their energy should be better used elsewhere. But for the sweeter, more sensitive type, then it would be super helpful to have that game because it balances you out. You know what I mean? Like for me,
yes.
I'm by nature or by culture, whatever that is, but regardless, by early on, a bit of a nerdy, sensitive, read books, this and that.
You're an intellectual.
And it would be very natural for me to say, okay, I want to spend my time doing meditation and doing Tai Chi and discussing philosophy on the beach and having this very la vibe, because it's in tune with what I gravitate toward.
Yeah.
The problem is, I think I go off balance that way. I will find myself in a lot of situations in life where that energy is not what it's called for. And then I will really not know what to do because all I know is that energy. There's nothing wrong with that energy. It's a beautiful energy, but it doesn't answer all of life's questions.
Right.
And so for me, because I'm going that way, I don't need to forget it all. It doesn't mean like, okay, burn the books and that's great. Balance it with some of the other stuff. So do the thing that for me is the least natural. Get into MMA, get into some of these things. And I find that when I balance the two, it leads to me being, it's like speaking multiple languages, you know? It's like life doesn't speak one language. If I know how to speak several, I always have a way to communicate with whatever problem life is putting in front of me.
So it serves as a powerful, like a personal growth metaphor, a personal growth tool set within like the sport itself.
Sure.
Right. But do you think that there is, how do I explain it? But is there a reason to know how to be, or I should say, how to take up self-defense or some sort of, I guess, violent defense mechanism outside of the sport? Is something that you think somebody needs in
which
life?
way outside?
I mean, just to like, I need to know how to defend myself so I could live in the world.
I think it's, even if, we live in a relatively safe society where the odds that you're going to have to use those skills is very, very limited.
Right. It's pretty low.
Totally. I think it's different for women. I think for women, would be absolutely important, more so than for men.
Sure.
But so for women, I would say yes, 100% of the time. For men, a little less so. But the issue is it's still beneficial psychologically. Like I find it that having those, and I think like a happy medium in this would be something like jiu-jitsu, where you're not punching each other's head. You're removing some of the trauma that goes with like boxing or kickboxing or the striking sports. It's still a contact sport. It's still a combat sport.
Is that what you do?
I've done a lot of different things over time. These days, I gravitate more toward grappling, because getting punched in the head gets old after a while. And so it's, I find it, that's more of a lifelong thing. Like the problem with a lot of striking sports is that it's often you have to train in a way that you don't know what you're really doing, because if you go too hard, you're giving yourself brain damage every day. If you go too soft, you don't know. It's like, this was a fun workout, but what exactly happened there? Would you have actually stopped me when you touch me like that or not? Because you're being nice, you're not hitting hard because we want to be cool, but it leaves too many questions. Grappling to me is great because you can go pretty full on, and as long as you're not a complete dick and you pull a submission too hard or do something. I mean, accidents happen like in any sport, but typically you can go pretty hard without really injuring each other in a major way.
Okay.
And so I enjoy that aspect because
is that like kind of Greco-Roman wrestling?
That too. That's a type of grappling. That emphasizes more the takedowns, like judo, Greco-Roman wrestling, freestyle wrestling, all of those are the takedown part. Two people start standing and you want to throw the other guy to the ground.
Okay, I see.
The Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu aspect is once you hit the ground, is all a game of position, submission, chokes, arm locks, leg locks, that kind of thing.
Okay.
So there's a finality to it. There's like, oh, you're about to break my arm. I'm going to tap. Good job. Nicely done. But, you can get to that point and you don't have to crank it because the person is pretty much immobile. They're stuck. They can't do much. And he's like, okay, good. We're good. Next. Let's do it again. Oh, now you caught me. Cool.
Interesting. Okay. Yeah, I could see that. And, and I think of somebody like, myself who was raised, just so far on the other side of that. And like my initial response to all of that has been, like my sport growing up was baseball, a non-contact sport, and anytime anything hinted at, contact, I get very, I close up and I honestly, just because I get scared.
Yeah, of course. That's a very normal thing.
Yeah.
But even that, being in a situation where being in a situation where the prospect of physical violence doesn't intimidate you the same way as you would if you had zero experience in it is kind of relaxing, because then there are a lot of situations where you don't get as... you're paradoxically less likely to get into a fight because people smell fear and they tend to they tend to hammer more if they see
if they could feel it.
Of it. Whereas if it's like, hey man, I don't really feel like doing this. Can we talk about something else and do something? I mean, if we want to do it, let's do it, okay?
Right.
But do we have to? It's like, I kind of want to go to the Moist tonight, you know? It's like,
right.
That's a little bit of a different vibe than let's not. It's like, oh, you're running away because you're afraid. I'm going to hammer on you, you know?
Right.
And so it's... I think it has worked out more ways for me, martial art in that sense, than in actual using the fighting. More times when potentially annoying situations were diffused when you're not as freaked out by the possibility that it may go down in a nasty direction.
I see. So it's preparing for all the different possible options.
It's kind of like, you know how most mammals, they don't fight with each other. They test each other. It's like wolves. You know, they're going to check each other out. They're going to do this dance of like growling and baring teeth and doing this and doing the other.
But it rarely gets to the kill stage.
Yeah, exactly. Usually establish, okay, we're happy with the message we got across. You are a little tougher than I am, or you're tougher than I want to find out. So I'll back away from this, you know, or something, you know.
Right.
It does happen, but it's rarer that then it goes full on and they actually go for it. You know, a lot of the time is a testing game. But if you don't have some of it are physical skills or experience behind it, it's very hard to pull off the ability to be somewhat confident.
Well, man, I think that just hearing you talk about this and unpacking it, man, I feel like, you know, the whole Trump thing, this identity he created for himself of being like, I'm this tough guy, I'm going to negotiate.
Totally.
And I look at him and going, wait, are you fucking kidding me?
Absolutely. Which is why,
this is a joke.
Which is why there's something nice about the option of saying, you talk so much shit, please back it up. Get into a cage with this guy. And same thing as the internet. You know, anybody can... Right. People write the nastiest thing to each other on the internet.
Yes.
To me, there should be the option of, okay, we meet in place A, and you say the same thing to my face. And you see how the message changes.
I'm guilty of it. I say things online I don't say in person.
Right.
I'm guilty of it.
And I think it's normal.
Yeah.
It's natural.
Yeah.
But I think it's a lot healthier. I was talking with this dude. It was pretty funny. He said some guy, he had a black friend and some guy on the internet called his friend a nigger. And so the guy just drove 300, found online the information about the guy who just called his friend a nigger, drove 300 miles, sat in front of his house, called him and said, you know, I kind of got a little bent out of shape about what you told me to my friend, and I had nothing better to do, so I'm actually sitting right in front of your house right now. And the guy, of course, flipped. He changed his phone number in about 0.2 seconds, deleted the post, and it was all done. Right?
Oh, my God.
It's not a bad reminder that there are consequences for speech.
That is fantastic. That's oh, man, that's just great. Remembering that these are real people.
Exactly. It's like, you know, if you really want to keep going down that line, somebody may call your bluff at some point.
But, you know, and it's amazing, like what, you know, this, how much you can actually project in the world, and this image that you can project, and, you know, a combination of words, a combination of attitude, of look, and media control, and this, you know, you can create this whole sort of, you know, projection of yourself and have people believe it these days. It's an amazing...
Which is why I do like the idea of, I always say it as a joke, but part of me like, oh, maybe that wouldn't be such a bad idea. My gladiator for world peace idea, which would be like, if you really hate each other that bad,
do it.
We
Figure
have a nice cage, we'll land the axe to you and an axe to the other guy. Right. Please go at it away from innocent people, no civilians involved. But you guys take care of it.
It's perfect. It's perfect. And, you know, like Trump is pretty good at golf, you know, and he is actually pretty decent.
Right.
Yeah, he's not, but he constantly cheats. And anybody who's played with him, he knows he gives himself the best lie.
Right.
He misses short putts, doesn't count it, constantly.
I didn't know that.
It's the perfect thing. Yeah.
Of course.
Oh, man. Well, this has been great. Thank you so much for coming.
Thank you, man.
Yeah, it's been a pleasure.